In this video, I will discuss some intriguing parallels between Tolkien and the author of Beowulf. As many people already know, Tolkien is famous for his knowledge in the studies of Beowulf. He did, after all, hold the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon Chair at Oxford University for some 20 years, so it is the general consensus that he had a fairly good idea of what the Beowulf poet had in mind when he wrote his famous elegy. In Tolkien's esteemed 1936 lecture on Beowulf, he said, "Slowly with the rolling years, the obvious has been discovered, that we have to deal with a poem by an Englishman using a fresh, ancient, and largely traditional material." The amusing thing about this quote is that it sounds rather like Tolkien himself. A poem by an Englishman. Tolkien was, of course, also an Englishman. He was of the West Midlands, or Old Mercia. He was aware that his name, Tolkien, had a Germanic derivation, just as the Beowulf text was either German or Danish or Frisian. But perhaps the most interesting part of this quote is that when Tolkien says, using a fresh, ancient, and largely traditional material, well, this is precisely what he did with The Lord of the Rings, as well as with the Silmarillion. Tolkien, he referred to himself in his 1936 Beowulf lecture a few times. At one point, he said that the Beowulf poet esteemed dragons as rare as they are dire, as some do still. But who were the some that he says in this quote? Well, further on, he added, "Even today you may find men not ignorant of tragic legend and history, who have heard of heroes and indeed seen them, who yet have been caught by the fascination of the worm. More than one poem in recent years has been inspired by the dragon of Beowulf." When Tolkien claims that more than one poem has been inspired by the dragon, he was referring to exactly two poems. The first being his own, Imona Gold Galdra Bewunden, which is line number 3052 of Beowulf, and in English it means the gold of ancient men wound around with magic. And the second poem belonged to his good friend C.S. Lewis, The Dragon Speaks. As for those who have heard of heroes and indeed seen them, Tolkien did, after all, witness the deeds of heroes in World War I, and it might be wondered if perhaps so too did the Beowulf poet witness deeds of valor and courage, which would not be unlikely, as he was living in 8th century England, the Dark Ages, fraught with frequent invasions and bloodshed. The Lord of the Rings is one of the most successful works in the history of fiction, having sold millions of copies. It is important to note that Tolkien had no idea this would happen, and for the most of his life he was a largely unread author. Similarly, Beowulf remained largely unread for nearly 800 years, but now it is one of the best-known works in the history of literature, and also exists in millions of copies. Of course, the Beowulf poet, too, would have been unaware that his work would one day prove such a success. All Beowulf critics agree that the poem is the work of a literate Christian Englishman. But the poem never mentions England, or Britain, or anyone English, apart from the characters Hengist and Offa. It refers to the Bible, but only Old Testament references. For example, there is no mention of Christ. In fact, it almost seems like the Christian reference is deliberately avoided. The Beowulf poet knows the verb to write, which is the Old English word riten, and he uses it twice, but on one of those occasions, and possibly the second as well, it does not mean write, but rather its older meaning, to cut or to engrave runes. Furthermore, the poet uses the word forskrifen, which is the normal word for write, but he uses the word to mean condemn. Based on this evidence, the poem seems to have been written not by a literate Christian Englishman, as all the critics have agreed, but rather orally composed by illiterate pagan Scandinavians. However, this viewpoint was almost completely erased ever since the appearance of Tolkien's 1936 lecture, for he gave a different answer. On the question of when the Beowulf poet was writing, Tolkien said the age of Bede, approximately 700 to 730 AD. So it is likely that the poem came from a time when conversion to Christianity was taking place, but not so entirely that the memory of pagan times had wholly disappeared. 3 times Tolkien called this a time of fusion, a fusion that has occurred at a given point of contact between old and new, a pregnant moment of poise. He makes it quite clear that he believed the Beowulf poet was looking back into the pit, perceiving the old tales of inevitable ruin, and yet feeling this more poetically because he was himself removed from the direct pressure of its despair. In other words, he was an illumined, baptized Christian looking backwards, aware of the contrasting difference between his own present time and a much older time which he was writing about in Beowulf. He was looking back with sympathy at people he knew to have been pagans, and so he may have considered them virtuous pagans. Virtuous pagans is a term that refers to those who lived morally upright lives but died unbaptized outside of the knowledge and body of Christ. The most important connection between Tolkien and the Beowulf poet is that they were both torn between two very contrasting traditions, one virtuous, the other virtuously problematic. They both believed in Christianity, yet at the same time felt sympathy toward the pagan. And here's where one sees yet more parallels between Tolkien and the Beowulf poet. Whereas the Beowulf poet was looking backwards, with admiration and pity, at heathenism, and on the brink of a new heathen challenge, Tolkien was a Christian also looking back at heathenism, and at the same time, at the growing heathenism of the future. In his own words, the northern heathen imagination has power to revive itself even in our own times. And he was right. 70 years later, England became a post-Christian country. Both men responded in a similar way. They created an anachronistic world populated by virtuous pagans, whose paganism is never openly confronted. Both worlds have excluded elements which one would expect to exist. But if they did exist, it would make the characters seem less virtuous. Both authors took the heathen aesthetic and cleaned it up to make it virtuous, using it as a means of artistic creation. To analyze this further, there are no slaves, nor human sacrifices in Beowulf. It presents the world as having no organized religion at all. It is a pagan world with no real pagans in it, it seems. And Tolkien did not think that this was an accident. He thought it was intentional. Tolkien's Middle-earth is quite similar. The riders of Rohan also have no slaves. There seem to be faint hints of a pagan religion noticeable in the place names in Middle-earth, such as in Harrowdale, which is the Valley of the Her, or the pagan temple. There is the Halifirian, or the Holy Mountain. However, there are no priests, nor anyone openly practicing any kind of religion. At Theoden's funeral, there are aspects of recorded pagan ritual. For instance, the raising of the mound, circling of riders, minstrels singing a dirge, and the burial of weapons and treasure with the dead. All of these elements are also similar to the burial of Beowulf. There is no mention of the pagan customs which real-world Germanic pagans would have practiced, for instance, killing of animals and a slave to follow his master into the afterlife. The outline of the chapter, The King of the Golden Hall from the Two Towers, is certainly modeled directly off of a scene from Beowulf. It follows almost exactly the etiquette found in lines 229 to 405. The name Meduseld adds a capital letter to a word used in line 3065, in which to inhabit the mead hall with one's kin means to live. This is a very clear view of the nature of heroic behavior, which Tolkien borrowed from the poem. Both works use the word heathen, or heathen. The Beowulf poet knew that his characters had been heathens, but did not want to condemn them. So when he uses the word heathen, he deliberately avoided applying it to people. Instead, he applies it to Grendel and the dragon's treasure. Similarly, in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien avoided calling his characters heathens, with two exceptions. In Beowulf, at line 179, sacrificing to idols is condemned as hope of the heathens. Again, at line 1983, Beowulf's aunt carries the drinking bowl to the hands of the heathens. It is intriguing how Tolkien applies the word heathen in The Lord of the Rings, and that he only uses it twice. "We will burn like heathen kings," says Denethor, while Gandalf says, "Only the heathen kings, under the domination of the Dark Power, did thus, slaying themselves in pride and despair, murdering their kin to ease their own death. By this, one might perhaps muse that Tolkien came to believe that the heathen references in Beowulf were quite intentional and should be imitated. And this last point, which I wanted to mention in this video, is perhaps the most intriguing, at least it is for me. When Tolkien first started to write about the Valar in the Book of Lost Tales, which can be found in the history of Middle-earth, they rather resemble the deities of pagan, Norse, and Celtic myth. But in after years, he proceeded to reduce this parallel, and the reason could have been that he was anxious with the idea of creeping too close to the line of real deities, as this would have been a transgression of the first commandment. By the time of the Silmarillion, the Valar became subordinate to Ilúvatar, the One. Tolkien may have found comfort in the fact that the Beowulf poet, also a Christian, seems to have placed demigods in his own work. At the start of the poem, Síl-Shéifing re-establishes the kingdom and then dies. His people place him in a boat, laden with treasure. The poet says that the Danes did by no means provide him with lesser gifts than those did who sent him forth in the beginning. The striking question is, who are those? The poet does not say. But the word those, which in Old English is thu, is used 62 times in the poem. But this is the only instance in which it takes stress and alliteration, indicating that the poet seemed to intend for it to stand out. The poet could have written he, thereby ascribing the miracle to God, which would make sense for a Christian writer. But he does not do this. He preferred to ascribe it to an unknown group of beings of supernatural power, seemingly supernatural power, and using them for the benefit of humanity. Well, does this not sound a whole lot like the Valar? Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it intriguing as I found these parallels when I discovered them. If you enjoyed the video, then leave a comment or subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. Thank you.